Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order for this afternoon, the Committee of the Whole meeting for the Town of Canmore. I'm Deputy Mayor Sanford, taking the place of Mayor John Borman this week. And before we move on to the approval of the agenda, are there any changes or additions to the agenda from administration? Thank you. So I'll call the meeting to order and I'll ask for the approval of the agenda. All in favor? Motion carried unanimously. We'll move through the agenda to item A, introduction of a new engineer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Council. I'd like to introduce Chantal Blais, our new municipal engineer. Chantal's coming from the consulting industry. She's been working in Calgary with Golder for nearly 20 years. She's got a background in civil engineering and hydrology with the master's, and is an 8-year resident of Canmore. So she's quite familiar with the community from a personal perspective, and also has done some work here through Golder in the past. So welcome, Chantal. I'd also like to thank Blair for his work over the past 5 years. He joined us just before the floods in 2013 and provided leadership and technical support through our recovery and our program to rebuild. He's also contributed invaluably to updates to our guidelines and utility master plans. These are some of our foundational documents, and the input he's provided into those will serve us well for the coming years and decades. Blair's going to be spending more time with his wife Pat and his local children and grandchildren, and he'll still be expected to continue to contribute with us in engineering and to the community through his consulting business. So thank you, Blair.
Thanks, Mr. Birch. Thanks, Andy. And the next item on the agenda is the introduction of the new Deputy Fire Chief. And I believe our Fire Chief, Mr. Galler, is going to make that introduction for us.
Yes, if that's all right. Good afternoon, Council. It's my pleasure to address you and to introduce you to our new Deputy Fire Chief. Carrie Martins comes to us from Lake Louise, where she was a fire chief there for 15 years. She brings a lot of background in the fire industry. She started as a volunteer, paid responder, worked up to the ranks of fire chief, and has built a really great little organization there. Interesting note about Carrie is that she is the first female member of the Canadian Fire Chiefs Association, which is a national body that guides the industry in Canada. That's a really substantial accomplishment. She's also a founding member of Women in Fire Leadership and a whole grocery list of volunteer experience. Carrie is from the Valley, and we're really looking forward to having that regional expertise, and will be joining us in the community in April, I believe. So we're really excited about the capacity she's going to bring to our organization. So if I could give her a moment. Thank you.
Will you come and say a few words? You look like you're prepared, so.
I just wanted to say that my family and I are really looking forward to making the move. My husband works for Parks, and we've been in the Bow Valley for a little over 25 years together, and we have 2 small children, 7 and 8, who love skiing and mountain biking and everything that really wants us to stay as a family in the valley, and this gives us a really great opportunity to do that. So hopefully we'll move. Right now, plan is the end of April, and then I won't be commuting, but my husband will. So I'm trying not to say too much about that when he's around.
Well, thank you so much, and welcome to the team.
Thank you.
I think you'll have a really good time here. So
we will.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we have one more person to introduce, an introduction of the new project manager for Public Works. And Mr. Fark's going to make that introduction.
Council, so unfortunately we were not really prepared for this, so I don't have a long background on Amy Bernard, who is our new Project Works coordinator at Public Works. But she's been with us for a couple of months. She's doing great work, and we expect more of that. And I'll probably just leave it at that.
Sorry, could you say her name again?
Amy Bernard.
Amy Bernard. Okay, great. Did you have anything you wanted to say, Amy? Would you like to?
Happy to be here.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. And then we'll move along in the agenda to the minutes of February 13th, Committee of the Whole meeting. Any errors or omissions? Nothing to add from council? So I'd like to move that we accept the minutes of February 13th. All in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. And the next item we'll move on to is D, staff reports. The first item will be Quarry Lake Audit Life Saving Society. And today we have Lisa Guest, Supervisor of Parks, and Mandy Long, Supervisor of Aquatics.
Okay. Good afternoon, Deputy Mayor Sanford and members of the council. Oh, thank you. So as you said, Ms. Guest and myself will be presenting on the Quarry Lake Safety Audit. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mandy Long, Aquatics Supervisor with the town. So, actually, I can flip through here. So we wanted to provide an overview of our presentation. So we're just going to do a quick background of the site, what took place, and the consultation we had with the Life Saving Society, our report and findings that they presented to us, and our next steps. All right. So, background on the site. Quarry Lake is surrounding areas, is co-owned by the Heritage Foundation, Quarry Lake Heritage Foundation, and the town of Canmore. It is operated through the town, through the Parks Department. Quarry Lake is long. It's about 260 meters long in length, and at its widest point, it's about 100 meters wide. It is quite deep. There are various reports where we looked up. We found it varying in depth from the reports we found, whether it's 30 meters to 100 meters, but we do know that it is cold and deep body of water. It is an unsupervised waterfront where we see people using it for weddings, events, and swimming on hot days, or just relaxing around the beautiful scenery. So what took place and why the safety audit? Over the past 3 years, we've had 2 drownings at this site, a 19-year-old female and a 28-year-old male. It is unknown the circumstances around the death, but we do know that they are visitors. They were visitors to the site. So, last summer, a little bit of information. The Life Saving Society does provide an annual drowning report. And when we look at the findings for the 2017 findings, the highest risk age groups are seniors over the age of 65 and young adults, 25 to 29 years of age. So we do see that the highest locations for drownings in Alberta are lakes, followed by rivers and streams. So those unsupervised bodies of water fit with what Quarry Lake and what happened there, and what we're seeing as a trend in Alberta. Okay. So we invited the Life Saving Society to come and provide us with a consultation. The reason it was the Life Saving Society is they are a national charity organization. They provide drowning prevention education. They are experts in lifeguarding, but they also do research in fatal and non-fatal drownings. So really, using that research is how we develop our standards, our safety standards, as well as using them as a body that we can go to for information and providing us with best practices. So, September, they came to provide the safety audit. It was an on-site visit where they visited the lakefront. They met with town supervisors, which was myself and Lisa, and we provided them with relevant documents for their review. And now Lisa's going to speak to the actual report and findings. Thanks, Mandy.
So what we found after we received our report in September was that our messaging at the site was not obvious. The messages weren't in appropriate locations, and there was no life-saving system in place, and we had a lack of operation site management documentation. So I'm now going to take you for a short walk around the site so we can see what's currently at the site, just in case you haven't been there recently. So as you approach the lake, you can see on the left-hand side there's a kiosk, and it has some information in that kiosk. And how many of us have actually stopped to read that? Pretty, not very many of us. And the information that's in that kiosk is quite buried, and the map is actually more of a map of Canmore, not so much the lake itself. It's not really telling us a lot of information about the site. A lot of information about dogs, there's some hours of use and an emergency call number. But really, everyone's looking to get to that lake. As we approach the lake, we've got another kiosk that's underutilised at this site. So the plan is to move this kiosk to the lakefront where we can provide information to our users. Once they've settled in, got their spot, they've relaxed, and now they're going to enjoy the waterfront. Everybody's more likely to start reading stuff then. When we get up to the waterfront, we've got the no lifeguard sign and our no dog sign. At the far end of the lake, so the east end of the lake, we have similar. Everyone's rushing to get to the lake at this point who's new to the area. They can't see the lake and they want to see the lake, so off they go. When we get to our waterfront, we just have our no lifeguard on duty sign. Then we have our two, what are known as the cliff jumps. This is the North Cliff jump. The red circle there you can see is the sign on the left that says jump and dive at own risk. On the South Cliff jump, the sign's not appropriately placed. It's kind of more to the west end of that location. And we can see people are up by that bench more so. Next steps. So what we're looking to do is adopt consistent messaging and symbols, wording that the Life Saving Society has recommended to us, and stuff that's used more globally, that people understand and see through the message symboling, regardless of what language you speak. Install 4 life-saving systems around the lake. So in the report, they did recommend that we put a life-saving system at each end of the lake. But internally, we've decided that it may be best to put 4 of those life-saving stations around the lake because both drownings have happened at the cliff jumps. And the recommendation was to put the life-saving devices at the beaches. The lake is 265 metres long. By the time we ran or somebody had to run to the end of the lake in a panic and come back, someone may have gone under. And create and update our sign management documentation. So that's the sign that's currently at the lake. And this is an example or a draft of what we're looking to move forward with. We've incorporated the way sign, or just some additional information. We've incorporated the wayfinding red into this sign at the top, which is trying to make some of our sites more inclusive. But the information that we're looking to get out here that the Life Saving Society came up with was hours of operation. We need an emergency phone call number, where's the local or the nearest hospital, what our winter season is, what our summer season is, when we operate this site, and how do we operate this site. The symbols on the right are symbols that the Life Saving Society uses generically around the world at different Life Saving Societies as well. So that's what we're trying to capture here. So this is a draft at this point, is open for review. The signage at the cliff jumps would go from jump and dive at own risk to no cliff jumping and no diving. Now we know those signs will be in place, but we still can't control what people take on and do at those sites. The sample on the right is just a sample of the life-saving style system that we'll be putting in place. It will consist of a post with a life ring and a reaching pole, and the standard life-saving sign that's universally known for life-saving equipment. That's on the left. If we look at an overview of the lake now, this is what it will look like. We have not increased the signage at the lake. It's the same amount of signage, it'll just be put in different locations. The addition being the 4 stations for the life-saving equipment. So as you approach the lake, you'll still see the first sign out by the parking lot that we hope will capture 50% of people that may still proceed to the lake or may not. Then we've got the same sign at the lake that'll be at the kiosk at the waterfront, where people can then take their time and enjoy and read a little more additional information. We have our 4 life-saving systems. We have our no cliff jumping and diving signs. And then heading from the peaks of grassy end of the lake or the east end of the lake, we have similar. This is just a sample of some of the documentation that we're looking to put in place. So we were actually missing information on when do we operate this site. We had information on when we clean the washrooms and how we do certain things up there, but what was missing was our opening and our closing season and what we actually do during these times at what frequency. If we're going to be putting the life-saving equipment at the site, we have to make sure it's inspected, and we have to make sure it's actually there when we perform an inspection. That's what we need to cover ourselves for liability. This is just a short piece. I didn't want to bury you with all the information. And then we get into layers of protection, and Mandy's going to take over.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so there's varying ways or levels of protection that you can provide at an unsupervised waterfront. This is provided by the Life Saving Society and terminology that they use. At the time of the audit, they found that we were at a level 2. When we look at the input of the primary recommendations as well as some of the secondary ones that Lisa just went over, we will move ourselves to a level 6 layers of protection. This is for an unsupervised body of water. It's not a supervised body of water. So these layers of protection are meant to provide education to the users on the known risks for where they're going to recreate. So really it's, I guess, unreasonable for us to say that we're going to control user behavior through this, but what we're really trying to do is provide adequate education and a means for them to perform a rescue if they needed to at the location. So that's the layers of protection. And we're at our summary. So we're going to be adopting the signage and symbols to improve public safety, as we've mentioned, installing the safety equipment, and these recommendations will be in place by the Parks Department by June 15th, the start of the summer season. Okay, and now we have any questions for us?
Well, thank you for that presentation. I think that's a pretty significant increase from going from a level 2 protection to a level 6. And you've taken some steps to do that in conjunction or in accordance with the Life Saving Society recommendation. So that sounds like a good procedure. Councillor Comfort?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I just wondered, was there any follow-up for the causes of death of the 2 drownings, whether there was some associated medical condition or whether there was a coroner's opinion or anything like that?
Okay, so I did reach out to the fire department, and at this time, I don't think we're privy to that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Any other questions? Councillor McCallum?
Why me, of course. So you've covered off how you're going to put new life-saving posts, reaching poles, et cetera, and lifesavers. How, from a liability perspective, and you touched on that briefly, how are we going to supervise that? So, you know, at some point, because this is an unsupervised body of water, and parks will put out all this equipment and signage, and then we'll have done a great job of that, and then we walk away. Mm-hmm. And then how often does this equipment get checked on? What happens to us if a town, if somebody decides that they want to decorate their rental home with a new lifesaver? How does that work?
Yeah, great question.
Reliable? Yeah.
It's kind of twofold there. I can answer the first part, and I think then I'll refer to Michael for the second part.
Michael's used to answering my questions.
So the first part is very operational based, like you said. So we had some procedures up there, but really no, I mean, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we clean the washroom.
Yes.
So now we're going and putting life-saving equipment. So if we look at this in a little detail, we've had to break the lake down into a 12-month period. So from April 15th to May 15th, we'll be up there once to twice a week to inspect. As long as we do what we say we're going to do, there is no problem.
Gotcha.
Right.
But if we don't do that,
if we don't do this, then
we
there's
have
a problem.
Right.
And when there's a schedule, this is what's called a level of service within the park's business areas. So whether it be for a dog park or a playground or a skateboard park inspection, we have a level of service. We say we're going to do those inspections. We do those inspections. We mandate ourselves to do those. And then if anything was to happen, those are the first records that are going to be pulled.
Right.
We checked it on Sunday and it was there, but the drowning happened on Monday.
Right. So if on Monday morning somebody comes to go to the park and says, oh, look, the lifesaver was gone because it went missing over the night, and they call the town, then we would respond to that and go, oh, we need to put one back up there.
We would put it up right away, and the intent is that we will have spare in stock so it can go up.
Of course.
I think right now within this I've got place, if you see on number 4, at this time, because it's a draft, if missing, the item will be replaced within 48 hours. We can change that to 24.
Right. Okay, that's great information.
So there's actually a standard in place.
Perfect. Thank you very kindly.
You're welcome.
So are we modeling this after some other facility where it's unsupervised and there are life protection systems in place?
Yes, good question. So really that's why we had Life Saving Society come, is they set standards for us. We don't have to follow, they're not a governing body, but by going there then we know that we're following consistency. So their report that they provided us is based on what they see with their research of what we could put in place, and then when you look around at other unsupervised waterfronts, varying levels of protection exists, but they're using the same approach.
And just one other thing to add to that is, when we started working with the Life Saving Society on this project, of course we went to them because we're not the experts in this area. A lot of this signage and symbol is done around the world, and in Alberta we're actually going to be the first lake that is going to be taking this on with the Life Saving Society.
Specific
This is specific symbols and signage. So this is something they're looking to roll out Alberta and Canada-wide with the other jurisdictions through other life-saving societies in Canada. So the intent is that as you go to a waterfront, you'll see consistent messaging, which is missing. So they've approached us and asked, can we work together on this?
Right. I think it's the signage. Like you see the similar messaging, but the signage is not the same. So we were trying to make it so the signage is the same.
So if that life ring goes missing repeatedly, do they have some recommendations for you about what to do about that?
I think the intent is that there's a similar system in place, and I'm going to use the life jackets for an example. There's actually another program they'd like to get us involved in involving life jackets, where you actually put a life jacket at the lake and allow people to use it. And if it goes missing, then what? Everyone thinks, well, this is going to cost us a lot of money. A life ring is actually going to save someone's life, and if somebody really needs it and they steal it, we have to assume that they really needed that item.
So you're hoping that the honor system will...
Exactly.
And the crucial nature of such a thing at a lakeside will encourage people to leave it in place?
That's exactly right. And we hope that, I think in Canmore there's a lot of ownership. I think we're going to see people, if other people touch it, we're going to see people saying, hey, originally I'd looked at, hey, this is not a toy sign, and it just gets all the messaging confusing, and the Life Saving Society recommended against it, and just using that one symbol, that life-saving equipment. So.
Okay, we have a question from Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Sanford. Just really good work. Following up on Councillor Comfort's question about the 2 deaths, I know you said that we don't know how they died, but I'm hoping that this information will be helpful in future deaths. Were they swimming alone?
No.
Something with the water conditions that could have contributed to it?
So the first individual, the female, I believe she was actually out here with a church group, and there was a large group and nobody noticed she went under. So she was actually here with a busload of people and no one noticed. So it can go different ways. I believe the gentleman, the 28-year-old, was here with 2 other fellow friends. And we actually had a team at the lake staining benches that day, and nobody saw anything. So that's how quickly it can happen.
So this will certainly help with that, but yeah, they both sound very unusual. So hopefully we can prevent future
So
deaths.
we'd have to say, you know, it could be it's an assumption, inability to swim, water was too cold. I think if you jump in that water, especially from the cliff jumps where those people seem to have entered, your heart goes into your throat because it is cold.
Yeah.
And if you're not used to that, I think that's going to have an impact.
And I think that leads to some of our next steps that we can look at is more public education on how to be safe in and around the water. There's potential that we're going to look at. Maybe not for this summer. We're going to include in our probably planning for our next round of budgeting, but is public education where we can do social media or different ways, maybe activating on site, where we can do some education on how to be safe in and around an unsupervised body of water. But really it's unsupervised, so swim with a buddy type messaging, life jackets save lives, that kind of thing.
I'm wondering about the signage at the cliff jumping about prohibiting cliff jumping. That's a pretty big step now, from swim at your own risk to no diving, no cliff jumping. And there's a number of other prohibitions at Quarry Lake, like no dogs. And so you've got a number of the cross-through signs. So are we expecting the same level of enforcement on no cliff jumping and no diving as no dogs?
That is a good question. There is not a bylaw against no cliff jumping or no diving. So this is just a recommendation based on best practice. There is no enforcement around it. If somebody still chooses, I think this is where we come into more of the risk side and liability side, where we've said we've identified this as a hazard and we've identified this as a risk. We would prefer you not do it. What we do know is if we fence those areas, it actually creates a higher vantage point for somebody to stand from and jump from, which increases the fall height, which is actually seen as more of a hazard. Yeah.
Councillor, sorry, I've got the CAO would like to speak.
Yes, I'm just going to supplement Ms. Guest's comments there. You know, we've had some of these conversations in the past. If we use prohibitory signs, there's an expectation of the public that it's potentially enforced. So if we don't intend to enforce it in any way through staffing or other means, we will likely have to look at changing these prohibited signs. But that's something I think we can talk about a little bit further. As we do have similar signs on Engine Bridge, for example, no jumping from the bridge, and we do enforce that. And the RCMP helps us enforce it. So, you know, if we're going to say it's prohibited, then I think it would need to be enforced in a way. And if we can't do that, then we might need to look at different signage.
Well, that would be my expectation. And I think if you have community out there and somebody's seeing people do something that is prohibited, you might have like a back and forth that might be uncomfortable.
That's great.
Councillor Mera?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Ms. Guest and Ms. Long, for your presentation. Very informative and good work. You're still going to have a sign that says swim at your own risk up there?
This is correct.
Okay. And are there any universal signs for temperature warnings for swimmers for people from other countries? Are you aware of that?
That's a good question.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe maybe there's something out there because you're referring to
like temperature varies with a temperature gauge.
We do have various words on the main sign that don't have all the symbols. We tried to focus more on the main messages that we wanted to get across. Again, it's a draft, so we're still going to be looking at is there anything missing for symbols. We won't be able to have everything in a symbol, but definitely I guess key messages is what we're going to try to do.
And some of these signs are displayed elsewhere in town, you said, like by the river or the Engine Bridge. Are there going to be more signage planned, do you think?
So this is just I don't want to use the word pilot. This is something we're putting in with the Life Saving Society. At this point, it's just at Quarry Lake. I think the intent over time is that other municipalities, other lakefronts, if we were to put more signs in as example, say we all of a sudden needed a sign at Riverside Park to warn people of currents and how dangerous it was, we would look at similar signage so the messaging is consistent.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor McCallum? Oh, your question was answered. Councillor Comfort?
Yeah, the other sign I was going to ask about was the depth of the water. So it drops off suddenly in some places, and other places it goes out quite a distance. Do you have signage to address that?
Yes, it's uneven bottom on the right side there with the yellow symbol.
Okay.
And then there's also messaging in the general information, I believe, that says something along those lines. So,
At the second point.
Quarry Lake is deep, contains cold water, and has an uneven bottom. So we can change that to is deep, temperatures vary, because they actually do. The first 6 feet are much warmer than the next 20.
I think the intent with our waterfront is this is our general information on a clean signage where you can easily identify it, not a bunch of other messaging mixed in there. We will be looking at further public education, which could have the other side of that kiosk, the washrooms, the side of the washrooms where we can utilize some different water safety messaging. And that's where you more see kind of that kind of messaging of like where the dangers are, swim with a buddy, like those kinds of things that kind of lead to that.
And winter ice messaging as well. We should have, they've got messaging for summer and winter. So I forget what it was, something about ice, and it shows a guy skating, and but it ties into this same messaging, so you're getting the consistency around. So,
thanks.
Now, they have consistent messaging. Do they also have signage symbols that they use, that they give you recommendations? I mean, is it like the driver's handbook where there's symbols? As a driver, you have to know what those symbols mean. Does the Life Saving Society have a list of signage symbols?
Not yet. Actually, these symbols that they're pulling is the international standards. Is where we want to say this message, so they go there and look at the international standards. But we don't really have something for waterfronts or for even indoor facilities yet that we can just look through and be like, oh, this is the message we want, so this is the symbol we'll use. I think we're seeing a trend, and it's moving towards that in nationally in Canada, of trying to use more symbols in our messaging. So even when we're working with the health department at our pool, at our facilities, so when we start updating signage, we're going to start looking at trying to use more symbols. But I don't have a way to go and just look at, oh, here's what they're using. Yet.
Yeah, so they don't have a catalog of signage. Well, I like the fact that you've got 4 locations for life-saving options, because I think when I first started going to Quarry Lake, we always went to the beachfront, and that was basically it. And there wasn't that many people in Canmore. And now I think when you go to Quarry Lake, people have different activities and expectations, and so they're all spread out around the lake now, which is quite different than it used to be. So I think it's good that you're covering all those angles. Councillor Hillstad?
Thank you for the presentation. For the rescue equipment stations, is it just going to be the reach pole and the throw bag, or is it going to, because I think they recommended in here to have an AED as well?
Yes, they did recommend to have an AD, but we only have them at town facilities at this point, and we just felt that it was too remote up there, and if it goes missing, where is it?
Yeah.
So we didn't go there at this point.
They're
usually at supervised sites.
Yeah, and that makes sense in my mind, because, yeah, don't really want people playing with that one.
Yeah.
Any other questions from council? Seeing none, thank you so much. That was very insightful.
Thank you.
Good luck. We look forward to seeing all this in place by the summer, correct?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Okay, so moving on. The next item on the agenda is item D2. It is the Homeless to Housing Coalition. And today we have Lisa Brown, Manager of Community Social Development, and Ella Jean Schatzman.
Good afternoon, Deputy Mayor, members of Council. Today we are here to share some details about Homeless to Housing Coalition and our 2018-19 work plan. I'm here not only as the Manager of Community Social Development, but also as the Chair of H2HC. And I would also like to introduce Ella Schatzman, who is a Program Facilitator for Bow Valley Addiction and Mental Health and the Vice Chair of H2HC. So Ella's going to go through the presentation for you.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the work that we're doing. It's exciting times. So,
do you want to just pull the microphone down just a bit so we can? Yes. Yeah, that's great.
How's
I can
that?
see you better. That's good.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Homeless to Housing Coalition, we affectionately call it H2HC for short. It is an intermunicipal, agency coalition that has been around for several years. It was initiated in actually the town of Banff in approximately 2006 to look at homelessness there. At the time it was called BRR, Banff Residents Responding Responsibly, with the idea of recognizing that there were several local residents, some of whom were living rough, that they were at risk for serious injury and potentially even death during inclement weather, and that people wanted to do something to help support those people during those times. And so move forward a few years, and this municipality joined that work, and the name changed just to reflect that it is a coalition between the municipalities and various agencies and organizations, church groups that have an interest and certainly look to support individuals where they may come into crisis of homelessness, and seeing the need to address that. And the best way to do that, of course, is collaboratively working together. So the homeless to housing vision is to ensure the supports to help individuals who are in a housing crisis, that they're in place within the Bow Valley, that we recognize just what a major concern this can be, and if we work together, then we can provide the supports. We know that there's a shelter down the road in Calgary. We don't have a shelter here, and we don't have the means to put one in place. However, we know that if we work together, we can try to support people preventatively as well as once they're present in a crisis. If they need to go down the road to Calgary, it may be helping facilitate that process. It's probably helpful to speak to some of the things that we're not as a coalition, just to clarify. We don't build long-term housing. We're not in the business of creating affordable housing. We recognize there are those needs in our communities, but our focus has been over the years, and certainly into the future, is looking at those in a crisis. So there were some changes over the last couple of years. There have been changes, membership in the coalition, just with staff changes and new, people moving in and out of the community, as you can imagine. And we found ourselves having some questions about our direction and who are we serving, and some of the data that we had been using to create a plan and a support network for individuals in crisis had really been based on information that had been received, 10 years ago, or certainly in the past. And some of us, myself included, who were newer to the coalition, we had agreed that we should take a look at that and do some strategic planning around what are the current needs. When BRR, as it was called back in its original days, when it was developed, it was recognizing some of the individuals who were living rough at the time, and it was just asking the question, is that still the need out there, or or should we be looking at other things? So we sought to understand the issue a bit more deeply, and we started collecting some data from those that work with individuals who present in crisis around housing, and just looking at what is bringing them to the different services and organizations. What are their demographics? What did they think would be helpful? Getting their feedback, getting the feedback from the membership in the coalition. The coalition is comprised of, as I mentioned, it's a larger group with representation across different organizations. We meet twice yearly as a large organization, and then we do have working groups that meet more often as needed.
Can I just ask you one thing?
Yeah,
I'm not sure about the terminology you're using, lived rough. Can you just describe what that is?
Yeah, for sure. It would be individuals who are perhaps camping or living out, who don't have any shelter.
And are people living in their campers or the back of their truck? Is that?
It could be that, absolutely. It could be, a makeshift housing out in the mountains, in the woods, that kind of thing.
Okay, so just...
Which was certainly identified in the community of Banff at the time back in 2006 as several individuals were, some of whom were choosing that way of life, and who at the time had identified that what would be helpful to them is somewhere they could go when the weather was so severe that they couldn't possibly be safe in their setting. It was only a few days in the year, in the worst of the weather. Hard to imagine, but some of those individuals, some of them choosing that, others who perhaps would have, were working with supports to eventually find housing, but were in that circumstance at the time.
Okay, good, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then, as you can imagine, when you build something, people show up. And so what we noticed over the years was that there are other individuals, indeed, who experience crisis in housing and may find themselves temporarily perhaps in between accommodations, or just in a crisis where they don't know where they're going to go tonight. And as you can imagine, if the weather is severe, it could pose a real safety concern if they had nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to clarify, because H2HC, we're not about emergency accommodation. We don't actually provide emergency accommodation. What we do is we organize the supports within the Bow Valley for people who are at risk or are in a housing crisis. And it might be emergency accommodation. It might be even just a $10 gift card to a 24-hour restaurant, or it might be a referral to Banff. So we're not... As in a coalition, we don't actually provide the emergency accommodation, but we organize services to make sure that people are not at risk of serious injury or death.
Yeah, and thank you, Lisa. Yeah, and sometimes it's really helping the individual who's feeling in crisis and not sure what steps to take. It's helping facilitate a phone call to Alberta Works for income support so they can get to family somewhere else, or a shelter in Calgary, or somewhere back to, potentially their home community if this isn't their home community. So the supports that are provided is varied, and it really is dependent on the unique circumstances of the individual that presents to us. But we just recognize and coordinating and streamlining what those options are for people can really help those, whether it's social workers or the helpers that are trying to move them forward in their planning, and just helping facilitate that. So we also recognized that we needed to create some common definitions for things like, what does emergency accommodation actually mean when people present? What's affordable housing? What constitutes a resident? And so that those of us in the coalition, when we're talking about these things, that we have a common definition that we're working from, and that we're speaking in common language when we come together. and recognizing that needs change over time, and so we need to collect data. We need to get the feedback from the community around what are the emerging needs so that we can, again, coordinate based on those needs. So thanks to the big support of the town of Banff, who provided facilitation. We did a strategic planning session last year in 2017. Had a lot of representation, which was wonderful. Dove deep into this and looked at the things that we thought were really important to revisit. And use the data that we had been collecting over the year prior to inform some of the work that we did during the strategic planning. A couple of key points from that work was recognizing that we needed an emergency accommodation space. So when that is necessary for an individual, having an adequate space that they could access. The other piece that was identified was that we really could use a coordinator who could help us analyze and collect some of the data and perhaps provide some better, more detailed program recommendations for us. And so, fortunately, there was a grant that was applied to with the Alberta Rural Development Network, and they have supported us and provided funding that will begin April 1st of this year for a full year that will fulfill these goals that we have as a coalition. In June of this year, we anticipate being able to hire into this coordinator role, which is going to just really augment the work we're doing and really help us move in clarity into the future. So then we can look a little bit at the work plan, some of which the coordinator will move forward and some of our working groups are already initiating. So the first one being the emergency accommodation procedure. Did we want to take a look at that now or to go through this first? So we recognize that there was different levels of knowledge even within our coalition. And so then when we considered, the expectation that all of these organizations and different people within the community would know where to steer people who are in crisis, we recognize we need to do a bit better job of streamlining what this process is, make sure that it's a real workable plan. And so one of our working groups developed this flow chart, which may at first blush look a little bit like a lot's going on. For those of us that do the work, it's very practical to use. And as you can see, we kind of go with this notion of every door is the right door, because people in crisis don't necessarily show up in one place. They could show up to victim services or the police. They could be at the hospital. They could come into the civic center to FCSS. And so we wanted to just indicate, yes, okay, regardless of where they show up, there is a process in place that can be followed. And you'll see there that, if people are in crisis and they need some support, often it's because, the primary underlying that is there's a financial need. And so it may be that they need to access some crisis financial support through Alberta Works. And so that would often be a first line of just looking, are they eligible? Can they get some emergency resources there that can move them forward for whatever plan makes sense for them, whether it's getting to family, whether it's staying, if they choose to stay at a hotel for a night, whatever it needs to be. But looking at that as a first option. And then just moving through, would it be helpful if I did move through that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, great. This is a question I got at Christmas. Yes, okay. Great. So, yes, and so then if they're eligible, again, depending on their circumstances, depending on whether they're residents, sometimes we'll come across people who show up in our community who are just passing through, that don't want nor need to stay here. And so income support will work with them around, okay, what makes the most sense for them? Are they on their way to Calgary? Should we offer them a bus pass, pay for that so they can get to the next place and not be at risk by staying here the night? So you can see that there's different things that can happen there. If they're not eligible, and there could be different reasons for that. Perhaps they have some finances and it's around mobilizing that. Perhaps they've tapped out of those resources. It could be a number of things. If not, then, part of the Homeless to Housing Coalition is, based on that original collaboration that was called BRR, we've held on to that name for this portion of what we do, which is we've kept, it's not an acronym anymore because it is intermunicipal, but we've kept the acronym in terms of just recognizing when there's inclement cold weather, we're going to take an extra step. If they don't have financial means, let's look at what other planning can we put in place to ensure their safety. And so then it looks at, again, any one of us as well would look at, is this their community, and do we need to support them here until they can secure housing? If they have, often people will come and say, oh, I do have housing, it's just not until tomorrow, right? And so we truly believe the humane response in that case is ensuring their safety for the night, however means possible. And so we would look at that. And then in terms of determining whether they are a resident or not, we have, as you can see in the box, there are some criteria around helping just discern whether this is the right place for them. Do you want to switch back? Mm-hmm.
The other thing we should mention about the accommodation procedure is that right now it's only for October the 1st until October the 1st until May 31st. So that's when somebody would actually access emergency accommodation. We would still work with people with Alberta supports if they are outside of those times, but this is really just for cold and inclement weather.
Mm-hmm.
Councillor Comfer has a question for you, if that's okay?
Yes, certainly.
Thanks for that chart. Is it possible to get you guys to email a copy of that to us, a PDF
certainly.
Or something?
Yes, we can.
Great to have that on hand. Thank you.
Councillor McCallum, did you want to have a question?
Thank you. So thank you for that. That's helpful, and I'll look forward to receiving that, because I had some questions over Christmas time because it was so cold, and my husband's cell phone number is in odd places on construction sites, and we were getting phone calls from people who were finding themselves without accommodation, who were just picking a number off a board and calling it. It was very interesting. So one of the questions I had was with regards to shelter. So there are no shelters that are in the Bow Valley right now.
There's the women's shelter for women and families.
Right.
Being
and so
violence.
Is there any other accommodation that's being provided or is planning to be provided at the Y for emergency overnight accommodation or anything like that?
So part of our emergency accommodation could certainly be, in the funding that we received, one was to hire the coordinator. The other piece of the funding was to renovate 2 rooms at the YWCA that we could use, that would be appropriate to use as emergency accommodation. So there is a distinction there. It's not a shelter, but should somebody come in through this process?
Accommodation, and that.
And so just like if they were to access income support, whether through a member of a coalition or not, income support may choose to access the Y due to their social profit enterprise. it's good bang for your buck,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, so that's an ideal location in that sense. And so 2 of the rooms are being renovated to help accommodate that.
That's great. And then
Yes.
I know that when the Catholic Church here locally presented with their building plans, they stated that they were going to have a section of their church that they were going to be using for emergency shelter as well. And I was wondering if Father Wilbur's had any conversations, because I know he's part of one of those housing coalitions that I used to attend and don't anymore.
Yeah, so that was for In From the Cold, a part of the Catholic
Yeah, they were
Church.
going to partner with In From the Cold
And
to
that-
sort of build a satellite, and that's
That
gone by the
program
wayside.
is no longer, yeah. So the program has stopped for all Catholic churches. And so the one that was going to be built in Canmore, it's no longer going to have that component of In
Oh,
From
so
the
they're
Cold.
not planning on partnering with anybody else?
As far as I understand, no, but we can follow up with Wilbert, Minister Wilbert to...
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's disappointing to hear. Interesting.
I think she's still doing her presentation, and she's
Oh,
going to go
I'm
through
sorry.
the
Okay.
work plan. I just thought you had an emergent question at that point, so we'll let you carry on with your presentation. Ms. Schatzmans?
Great, thank you. Okay. Where was I?
I think you're on your work plan.
Yeah,
Yes,
and so
there we
part
go.
of, right, thank you. And so part of the planning is around, so one of our goals moving forward is around building better relationships with the urban centers, because indeed sometimes a referral to the shelters and supports in the urban center in Calgary makes the most sense for individuals. And so we want to just build some better relationship. So that's part of the work plan moving forward, is to do that. And then also having an improved communication and an awareness plan. So, initiating that partly here today, ensuring that, the good work that we're doing is known in the community. And just in terms of awareness around, what are options for people and where can they go if they're finding themselves in a crisis, or if individuals are working with somebody that's potentially going to become in crisis. So that could be somebody, a formal support, but of course oftentimes it's family, it's friends, it's other people in the community that might become aware of somebody who's may be facing a housing crisis. And of course, another piece of the goal and the work plan for the upcoming year is around trying to secure some sustainable funding and looking at ways that we can do that to ensure that we can continue this work on into the future. Okay. So I think I am here, hey? So I guess the final piece I just wanted to mention is that the Homeless to Housing Coalition is supporting the Alberta Rural Development Network in hosting a Canada Rural and Remote Housing Symposium in Canmore here, October 24th to 26th. So that's super exciting news. Okay. Yeah, and I don't know, I don't think I need to go into that. What do you think? Okay.
Is that the end of your presentation then?
I had a little bit more information here if you're interested around the executive team and who's at the table there.
Yeah, that'd be great to hear.
Happy to share that. As Lisa mentioned, she's the president, and currently I'm the vice president. We have Rayanne Roberts from the YWCA as our treasurer. And we have 3 directors, Sean Carr from the Town of Banff, FCSS, and then Scott Devnick, who's from Alberta Works, the income support, and Tara Gilchrist, of course, from FCSS here in Canmore. And so we, as I mentioned, Lisa and I are part of the communications working group. There's also a stats working group that looks at both qualitative and quantitative data, collecting and understanding that. And then the work around the flow chart and the procedures, that's a temporary group, but that's currently still together and having some upcoming training, just to, again, streamline, but also to build some more awareness around what's available to people and how to access the supports in place. And so, yes, and so those in the coalition, as well as partner agencies and anyone that we think would be useful to have at the table that may come in contact on a regular basis with people potentially in a crisis, have been invited to the training. And then we're hoping that the people who come to that initial training will take that back to their groups or organizations and spread the word.
So the way we organized H2HC is we have a larger membership group that meets twice a year, and then that's going to be guiding the H2HC and will be informing on the work of the working groups. And then we have the working groups that Ella just shared with us. And those working groups are very specific around our work plan to try to move it forward, making sure that we have the information, that the urban relationships, that we have good stats, that we're applying for funding. And then we have this temporary procedure and training group, which we're just, the reason you hadn't seen this procedure before is that we're just in the midst of finalizing the procedure and then doing training on the procedure, and then we'll be spanning it out to everybody based on that.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
So, are you ready to answer some more of our questions now that you've finished your presentation? Great. You're
Certainly.
on the question slide. One of the things that I'm curious about is when we have businesses or organizations, hotels that have staff accommodation that's linked to your workplace, do you see a lot of that homelessness as a result of people no longer having workplace provided accommodation if they terminate their employment at a workplace? Is that something that we see a lot of in the Bow Valley? Is that something that you would see a lot of?
So I don't know that I could speak to how much of it happens, but certainly people do access through our services support when that does happen. Certainly through the urgent mental health service. There are times when individuals have lost employment and, may have other psychosocial factors that might have led to even the changes in their employment status. So they may be coming to us for many reasons and needing support on different levels. So I suppose the short answer would be yes, but I don't know how much.
So you're there for those people as well? I mean,
absolutely.
You're there to support that situation if it arises.
And they may move through this process, or they may not need to because there may be other resources or supports that can be accessed. Yes.
Okay, Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thanks again for your presentation. It's important work. I have a question about, I didn't see it in your material there, but does the police form, because they'll often be a point of contact, first point of contact for people who are struggling because of housing, other issues as well, but also I know I found someone sleeping in the CIBC lobby one night, more than once, and that sort of thing. So how do you work with the police?
So certainly we do. So depending on the reason that they are finding themselves in contact with the police, it may be that then the police will determine what the next step would be. And so it may be bringing them to the hospital, perhaps because there's medical or mental health concerns that are tied into how they find themselves to be homeless. So that might be the first step. It could be victim services if there's something going on that way. Or it could be a night in cells, depending on, what's going on,
Sure.
With that individual.
I believe from time to time, rarely, people have spent a night in cells because they're going to be at risk if they're just out in the community. It's that cold and so forth. And I really like the notion of every door is the right door. And so do all of those doors know that they're the right door? Are you guys going to be able to get the information to them so they can then carry on from there?
Yeah, so we do have victim services at the table who liaises with RCMP. Is RCMP on their membership as well? Sorry. Yeah, so they're at the table, and they certainly get all the communication around the supports as well. And what's the other piece I was going to say to that? Yes, and so yes, they've been invited to the training. They'll also get the procedures and all the communication that we have that's refining and streamlining this. So certainly we would hope that there would be improved education and understanding moving forward.
Yes, because as Councillor McCallum mentioned, you have the feeling sometimes there are services out there and there's a right place to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be more direct to go, say, to somebody on that list, on that grid, if you had the grid, rather than phoning the police and saying there's somebody sleeping in the lobby of the CIBC or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for this, and good luck in your continued work.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just looking in your report under stakeholder engagement, you have a whole list of agencies that are involved. So everybody that's part of that stakeholder engagement group would be knowledgeable about your program and would be an access point to the program?
Yes, and getting back to the RCMP, sometimes they may be the first point of contact, and they may provide transportation to a service provider that can then move through the procedure. So yeah, very important for them to be aware. Absolutely, yeah.
Good. Any other questions from members of council? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you. So I noted that we've talked about housing for people who are possibly are from Canmore or established in Canmore, and we've talked about how we can transport people to maybe where their housing's waiting for them in Calgary. How are we managing transporting our Indigenous neighbors? Perhaps, like I ran into a pair of gentlemen last week that were on their way into the offices looking for FCSS because they were stranded in town. There's no bus stop, and there's no safe way to transport oneself from a bus stop on the highway, if even there was one, from a Greyhound perspective. How are we managing to get our neighbors back to their home when they find themselves stranded in town without any real public transportation available?
That's a good question. I mean, I could only speak to it from urgent mental health perspective, because sometimes they do access that support. And there are measures to have transportation, but I can't speak to the details of that. That's a good question. Maybe Lisa could speak to it.
Yeah, so part of the BER fund that we can access is also for transportation. So we'll always access Alberta Works first.
Right.
And if they will sometimes do a taxi if that's appropriate, or they will do busing, which doesn't go onto our neighbors in Morley. But if they are unable to access taxi, the BER fund can pay for the taxi services.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Any other questions from members of council? Seeing none, thank you so much for your presentation today, Ms. Schatzman and Ms. Brown and Ms. Gilchrist is at the back of the room there, so they're all involved in this program, and I'm hoping that with the funding that you have for this next year, you'll be able to put together a really good program that carries into the future with whatever mechanisms you can come up with in stakeholder engagement and connection. So thanks so much and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks.
And with that, I will invite Robin Naj, Manager of Communications, and Lisa DeSoto to present item D3, Explore 2026 Olympic Update. Considering the Olympics are still on, this is very timely that you're presenting to us. The Paralympics
are still on and well underway, and Brian McKeever became the most decorated Paralympian in Canadian history, so that's exciting.
And we applaud him. That's fantastic. That's incredible.
Yes, very exciting. So thank you, Deputy Mayor Sanford, members of council. We're here today, Robin and I, to provide you with an update on some of the items we've been working on. So as you'll recall, this past December, I brought a report to council to recommend that the town of Canmore do their own work to determine how we wish to consider a potential Olympic bid for Calgary and the town of Canmore for the 2026 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games. And as a result of that report and discussion with Council, Council approved a $200,000 budget to be funded from the Economic Development Reserve for a number of activities to be undertaken, and they're listed there. Secure an expert advisor, and mostly I've been speaking directly with City of Whistler officials under that capacity. We haven't yet begun seeking professional legal advice, etc., which is what we thought the bulk of that budget might be needed for. Conducting public engagement was also a large chunk of that budget, and we've started that, and you'll hear much more about that later in the presentation. Providing a staff member to sit on the City of Calgary's organizational structure for their bid evaluation, and funding the observer program for Pyeongchang, and we'll talk about all of those coming up. So to better understand the potential impacts and possible benefits to our community, Council approved activities that will help to inform your decisions, and today we're here to give you a little bit of update on some of those activities. The first being, very briefly, I'll talk about some of the learnings from the Pyeongchang Observer Program, and also talking about Jim Yonker's secondment to the City of Calgary's committee, our Dialogue Phase Committee. And Robin Denage will be giving the bulk of the presentation to share the results of our community engagement to date. So just moving on then to give some highlights of the Pyeongchang trip that Mayor Boroman and I were on. We attended as part of the second wave of delegates at the end of February 20th to 26th. We were there along with Kyle Ripley, who is one of the senior City of Calgary admin staff working on the project. Jean Edworthy was there. Jean is a former Canadian Olympic Committee member and a Calgary Bid Exploration Board member as well. Minister Ricardo Miranda was there, along with Patrick Mattern, who's a director under Alberta Tourism, Culture and Tourism. And the wave that had gone before us included a number of representatives from the City of Calgary as well, including Mayor Nenshi and some City of Calgary staff. Also there representing the province was Deputy Premier Sarah Hoffman and the Federal Minister for Sport and Persons with Disabilities, Christy Duncan. And there were also First Nations representatives that attended not necessarily as part of the City of Calgary delegation, but at the request of the Assembly of First Nations. And they, though, did interact with our first wave of delegates that were there from the City of Calgary. And that is a photo from the closing ceremonies, just as the Canadian athletes were walking in. That's the way it looked on TV, too. Yeah, I bet you. You might have even got closer up. So specifically, our objectives that we had identified for ourselves at the town of Canmore, Mayor Boroman and I, were to witness, experience, and learn about some key elements of hosting the Olympics. Specifically, the Athletes' Village, live sites, community impacts, transportation logistics, and liaising with local government. And that is a photo of the Athletes' Village in Gangneung, and they hosted approximately half of the athletes and team officials at that location. So Gangneung was the coastal cluster city, and that's where all the ice events were held. That Athletes' Village I was lucky enough to get a full tour of. An Athletes' Village is considered behind the fence, so most people would not be able to access that. Really getting an understanding of scale and scope and the kind of services that are offered to athletes was quite valuable. With regards to the live sites, there's much that happens. I term it, in front of the fence, so open to the public. And that was much of what the city and municipal governments were putting on: the cultural events, the celebration atmosphere that happens on pretty much every street corner in those municipalities. We did speak with city officials and provincial officials, and this is just a photo of us meeting with the team at the city of Gagnon that were tasked with delivering all of the municipal services in support of the games. We also toured many facilities and venues. We did our, as I was suggesting, self-discovery tours of the local cultural opportunities. There were a number of hop-on, hop-off buses that would take you around to cultural destinations, Coffee Row, different public art areas, temples, that type of thing. Mayor Borman was very interested in all of those, and I think he did most of those hop-on, hop-off tours. We attended a number of events, including the closing ceremonies that you saw. And as was mentioned, we have delegates currently at the Paralympics. Both our General Manager of Municipal Services, Sally Cottle, is there, as well as Jim Yonker, who is acting in his capacity as Project Manager of snow sport venues while he's there and getting full tours of all the snow sport venues. So we are going to wait for the return of the two of them, as well as the rest of the delegates from that wave, to do a full debrief with all of the waves, and then we'll do a full report on the Pyeongchang trip for council and the community. Just to give one more slide before Ms. Dinaj comes up and tells you about our public engagement. But this is the work that Jim Yonker's been doing. A large chunk of the budget was to continue to pay for his salary and allow him to be seconded to the City of Calgary team that's doing much of the bid investigation and analysis. So Jim's occupying the Project Manager Snow Venue role. He has he's responsible for reviewing all venues in detail with the operators, and that includes the potential snow jump facility at Whistler Olympic Park, the potential alpine venue at Lake Louise, the Canmore Nordic Center for cross-country and biathlon events, Nikiska for giant slalom, and some of the skier and snowboard cross events, and Canada Olympic Park for all of the slopestyle half-pipe events. All of those are considered snow venues, and Jim is the key person and subject matter expert on those venues. And so he'll be working on creating the capital budgets and operating budgets and agreements for those facilities with all those venue owners. And of course, when you look at all of those venues, the focus is on using existing facilities that are already in place and have been hosting World Cup events in the very recent past, and extending the legacy of those venues into the future. But while he's sitting on that org structure, he's also representing Canmore's interests in the development of the overall games concepts, and he puts forward Canmore sort of perspective for issues such as metal presentations, transportation, logistics, and security. And as we learn more about the bid and get more involved in the bid, should a bid corporation be struck, and that is something that we hope and anticipate a decision on that in the coming weeks, then we will start to get more involved in a meaningful way. So I can maybe entertain a few questions before passing it off, if there are any, or we can have Ms. Dinaj come up and give her presentation on public engagement, and then I'll be around to step in to answer questions at the end if there's any.
Any questions from council? I have a question for you, Mr. Soto. Having experienced the site of the most current Olympics, what was your perspective on security? How did you feel as a visitor to South Korea and the levels of security that were provided throughout, whether it's the Olympic venue or the live sites that you mentioned?
Yes, so Korea is a very safe country, and there was a heavy police presence, but they were in sort of the fluorescent yellow vests. They weren't wearing flat jackets or carrying automatic weapons or anything. In fact, in Korea, police don't carry any weapons. But there was security at each entry point to the Olympic Plaza. And once you got into the coastal plaza, and the security is very much like going through airport screening. So you have to put your knapsack through, and you have to empty all your pockets and take your jacket off, etc. So there can be long lineups to get through that. But then once you're in the Village Plaza, you have access to all the venues that are accessed from that plaza. The live sites and the cultural exhibits, and really where we saw most Koreans milling about, was outside of the fence, so no security whatsoever. And certainly seemed to be enjoying that whole experience as well. Yeah.
So by going there, you got a good grasp on the impact that the Olympics had on those communities and at those venues, by going behind the fence and also experiencing?
Yes, certainly from my perspective, you do get a first-hand feel for it, absolutely. And how, whether or not the way they managed their security is applicable to how it might be managed here is a question mark. Their venues were quite compact. So they were able to have one large sort of Olympic plaza, as opposed to having a security around each specific venue. So yes, but certainly got a sense for what it takes to secure those sites. Mm-hmm.
I don't see any other questions, so maybe it's Ms. Dinaj. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Not sure. Okay, there you go. Councillor McCallum?
No, you just turned me on.
You're on.
Sorry. Okay. I just had a flash question with regards to the photograph that you showed of the Olympic, the Athletes Village. What's Korea's plans for those high rises?
Oh, excellent question. So they were 100% sold. So they are being turned into condominiums. It's a housing project.
And
yes.
How large of a community is Pyeongchang?
So that development that I showed you is in Gangneung.
Okay.
And that city is approximately 200,000 people. Pyeongchang is 45 minutes away, and that's where the mountain cluster was, and there are about 30,000 people.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Thanks very much.
Okay, so no other questions. Ms. Dinaj.
Thank you. So council will consider many factors when you make a decision about whether to participate in a potential bid, and public opinion is one of those factors. However, the public was not asked whether or not we should participate in a bid. That is a decision that will be made by council. Instead, public engagement focused on hearing from the public about their priorities and their concerns regarding a potential Olympic bid. As part of the public participation plan, we conducted 4 main activities. We created a new webpage, we hosted an open house, we connected with leaders of community groups, and we launched an online survey. And so I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the results of each of those 4 areas. So as the first step in public engagement, we created our new webpage, canmore.ca/Olympics, easy to remember. It was created and promoted through newspaper ads, through social media, and that was really to inform the public about the initiative and about the engagement. And the webpage received more than 1,300 page views since the beginning of 2018. Next, we hosted an open house, and it was on February 13th, and the goal was to provide the public with an opportunity to ask their questions and express their concerns and their values. and 85 people attended that event, and more than 200 comments were written on Post-it notes and submitted. There was a fairly balanced perspective when I went through and counted up how the Post-it notes were placed. There was about 45% concerns, and about 55% of the Post-it notes noted opportunities or benefits. And then Ms. DeSoto connected with leaders of 8 different community groups to inform them about the initiative and to encourage their members to participate in the survey and come to the open house. And they also to hear their preliminary concerns and priorities, and to request time in the future to take part in a deeper conversation about what hosting the games might mean. And then lastly, the online survey was open between February 5th to 23rd, and that was really to learn more from the public about their priorities, concerns, and values. There were 813 responses, and the average completion time was 15 minutes. That's the average time each person spent on the survey. The feedback was really helpful to understand the community's priorities and concerns. And although 90% of the respondents indicated they saw opportunities for the community as a result of the 1988 Winter Olympics, the other feedback was much more divided. And since this survey was self-selected, I must point out that this data is not statistically representative of the town as a whole. The sample pool was not randomly selected, and the results of the survey should be interpreted with the understanding that it was a public link available on our website and through social media. And that meant it was accessible to anyone who wanted to take the survey. And just as a point of comparison only, CBEC, the Calgary Bid Exploration Committee, as you may recall, they commissioned a survey in May of last year, and that was to gauge public opinion surrounding a potential bid. And it did include a random sample of 303 Canmore residents who were surveyed. And just a quick refresh on very high-level results. 66% supported the Calgary region bidding for the Olympics, although 9% believed there would be a net positive impact on the environment. 61% believed there would be a net positive impact on the economy. So that's just a little bit of a comparison between a statistically valid sample versus our survey, which got great response and we got some great feedback from, but not statistically representative of the community. That having been said, I won't go into detail about all of the survey results. I did post all of the results on our website. If anyone would like more information, there's a very complete report there. However, I do have a few results that I wanted to show you to highlight some indications of how these results really show opposing points of view. So for example, an average score of 53 out of 100, so this was on a sliding scale where the average was 53, it was given to show how much respondents agreed with the following statement. The positive legacies from a potential Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games in 2026 could outweigh the negative impacts of hosting the events. Another example, an average score of 41 out of 100 was given to show how much the respondents agreed with the statement, I believe hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games makes financial sense. And the last example I have for you is that 36% of respondents indicated that a potential Olympic bid distracts us from the vision stated in the municipal development plan, while 39% indicated that a bid would move us towards the community's vision. So, as I mentioned earlier, the public wasn't asked whether or not we should participate in a bid. That decision will be made by you. However, a primary objective of the activities in phase 1 of the consultation was to get an understanding of the public's priorities, their concerns, and their values. So we took all sources of feedback and we consolidated it into themes. So based on what we heard, here's a summary of what the public stated as their issues and concerns with Canmore's involvement in a potential bid for the 2026 Olympics. So I wasn't planning on reading them all. I know that they're in your package, but I think that you will recognize some of these issues and concerns as the same ones you're hearing in the community. Conversely, based on what we heard, here's a summary of what the public stated as potential benefits and opportunities with Canmore's involvement in a potential bid for the 2026 Olympics. Again, I won't read them all. I know that you're fairly familiar with it and you've reviewed the package. So what did we do with what we heard about the concerns and the opportunities? Well, a primary purpose of the public engagement was to reflect the priorities and the concerns into draft principles that could guide you as you consider participating in a potential bid. So to create these draft principles, a combination of three things were used. What we heard from the community, which is just what I've recapped, also best practices from outcome reports from previous games, and thirdly, alignment with Canmore's strategic vision. And while the full list of 13 principles is listed in your package, I just wanted to show you how we came up with a few of them. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how the principles were drafted. So for example, we looked at the very real concerns of the pressure on real estate combined with the fear that living in Canmore will become unaffordable. We also looked at what the benefit would be if, for example, an athlete's village was converted into affordable housing for local residents after the games. So we articulated a principle that says, considering the livability and affordability of Canmore as a priority area of focus that could be used as a lens through which key decisions could be weighed around Canmore's involvement in a potential Winter Olympic bid. Another example was to look at the concerns expressed by the community around increased greenhouse gas emissions, harm to wildlife, and overuse of waste and water services. We also looked at what the opportunity would be if, again, for example, we could enhance our transit system, we could upgrade our water and our waste systems, and use the games as a catalyst to showcase our ability to be a leader in green games. So we articulated a principle of weigh opportunities against how Canmore can be a municipal leader in environmental stewardship that could be used to ensure concerns are addressed and benefits are maximized. And my last example shows how we heard some community members concerned that hosting an Olympic Games just doesn't align with plans for the town, while hearing for others that it's also an opportunity to bolster our community spirit and our volunteerism. So aligning what we heard with Canmore's strategic vision outlined in the MDP, Minding the Future, and the Environmental Sustainability Action Plan, that helped us to articulate a principle of make thoughtful decisions that Canmorites can be proud of and that align with our community identity and values as identified through the Town of Canmore's guiding documents. And that principle, again, could be used to guide decisions around a potential Olympic bid. So those were just 3 examples of how the draft principles were developed. There are 13 total principles that came out of the first phase of public engagement. All of the principles are listed in your package. I will note that although we did come up with 13, and that seemed like a lot, we really did not have any preconceived notion about how many principles would be the right number to have. And the approach was simply to consider best practices in combination with the community's interests. And many of the principles we already compressed so that it wasn't just a massive laundry list, yet the intent was still there to ensure that they weren't generic statements. And the aim was to have Canmore-centric, meaningful principles. So just as a side note, Whistler had 11 principles, but there's no right or wrong number, and it's really the quality of principle that should take priority over having a specific number of principles. So now that we have our draft principles, what's next? The second phase of stakeholder engagement begins next week, and the purpose of the second phase is to have the public evaluate the draft principles. As well, we'll be using the second phase of engagement to provide information to the public where we can about what we're learning from our participation in the Calgary Dialogue Phase Committee. So reporting back some of the learnings that Jim Yonker is being exposed to as part of his involvement. And then at the May 2018 Committee of the Whole, we will be back here to present the final principles to Council and inform the public on how their input was used. So that wraps up the update on the activities for public engagement, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
That's very interesting to see how we've correlated some of those concerns with potential addressing of those concerns as we go forward. So certainly we're going to see a lot of diversity of opinion on this. And I was really impressed with the turnout at the open house that you had at the coast, and how many people came and how considered and reflective, and you know, I thought people were really coming at it with good intentions and good feelings, expressing their concerns, but also, you know, being open to the concept of where we go next. So. I'm looking forward to seeing more of that community engagement and people coming out with really thoughtful ideas and questions.
And what we are hearing is that as people have their questions answered, in some cases it is shifting their opinion about what they might think about their involvement.
Any other questions from Council? Councillor McCallum.
So, and thank you for your presentation. It was great. So at the May Committee of the Whole, after having done more consultation, you'll be vetting these draft principles with the community. And so when is it Council's decision to decide what principles we will be looking at?
I will perhaps look to Lisa for some assistance on that if I don't answer it, if I can't give you a proper answer. But my thought is that Council has done some preliminary work on what you think your initial thoughts might be around principles that could guide you as you make a decision. The intent in going out to the community was to hear from the community what they think should be considered in your decision-making process. As you read through the principles that were included in your package, my hope is that those principles resonate with you and that you are out in the community and you're talking to people about it as well and hearing from the community if those principles reflect what they said in that first round of engagement. And then we still need to, I'll be working with Ms. DeSoto on what the next steps will be for Council if you need to have an open session. I'm not sure of the exact procedure about how you would validate those or just accept those as presented, and then what your next steps would be in making decisions that are before you.
So does that mean we're going to decide or we're not going to decide?
Just to confirm, there will be a decision report following the May Committee of the Whole. So probably it's similar to how we bring you all draft documents. Committee of the Whole is your first attempt, and
that's what I figured. I just thought I would ask the question.
So we will have to come back with a decision report at a meeting following that meeting to get you to approve the principles, and then those will guide decision makers moving forward. As to how they represent Canmore's interests in evaluating the bid and preparing the bid should it go forward.
Gotcha. And then my next question is, you spoke of when you, at the open house, and I had an opportunity to attend, it was well attended, that people's opinions were changing as more information was being provided. There's not a lot of information that we know about, so how are we going to be able to gauge an appropriate opinion from someone if we're not actually, by no fault of our own, not providing them with a lot of information?
Agreed. And that's certainly, while it was intentional to just go out with the community during the first phase of engagement to purely hear what people thought, and we in no way wanted to influence what people were expressing as concerns or opportunities. We did not want to influence that by going out with any kind of information in advance that could be could be
static.
perceived, or could be perceived as being influential, trying to influence people. We really wanted to be completely unbiased. I think we are unbiased in this. And that, but certainly we heard that people want more information, and that was always the intent of our second phase. We are needing to ensure that anything we do talk about in terms of the type of information we can release, we need to be checking with the Calgary committee to see what is public information and what might be part of a confidential bid.
Right, and that's, I understand that. I just...
The example I could give you might be that in a few people I've spoken with, they were very concerned about the potential of ski jumping towers being built at the Nordic Center. And they were completely against that. And then I think it even may have come out in the newspaper, and we had repeated that that's not part of the plan. And it was interesting to watch how that person then said, oh, well, in that case, then I don't think it's such a bad idea after all.
So misinformation plays a key, but information also has to be provided. So I've seen comments, well, if Whistler could do it, why couldn't we? As if the Olympics comes as some gift-wrapped present and all that infrastructure just arrived by the Olympic ferry. And as we know, there was a lot of back and forth and many years of preparation and negotiation that got Whistler what they got. And so I guess that information is, I think it in some ways lacking. People just think it just arrives or somebody else provides it. And who is somebody? I guess that's what I'm concerned about, is that, I understand we're not trying to influence people's decisions with facts that maybe aren't permanent facts. It could be a fact at that moment. But I'm wondering how we're going to let the public make to give us proper feedback if we don't really have a lot of information to give them.
And we are hoping to have,
which then makes the draft principles difficult for them to resonate with and difficult for us to identify with and make a decision on.
Yes, and that's why we took the approach of principles versus, we know it's a very complex answer to what people might think is a simple question, should we or shouldn't we participate in a bid? But as you've just said, there's a lot more to it, and we're hoping to have some of our frequently asked questions ready by the end of this week and up on the website next week, and we'll be working on a campaign to help spread some of that fact correction out there next week.
Thanks very much, Ms. Denage.
Any other questions from council for Ms. Denage? Seeing none, thank you for presentation and for bringing us up to speed where we are right now, but we know that that's a potentially changing target, so we'll keep moving forward.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda is E1, Councillor Updates. In our package, we have written reports from each councillor on their activities in the last month with their committees, etc. Any questions to members of council who have sent in a report from one councillor to another? No questions? It's all clear? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next item then. F1 service area reports. So this starts with the CAO's office. Any questions on updates provided in the service area reports from the CAO's office? Moving on to the General Manager of Municipal Infrastructure. Any questions? Concerns? General Manager of Municipal Services, anything in there you'd like to ask a question about? Human Resources? Finance? Moving right along. Going on to B, municipal services. We have item under number 1, community social development. And I believe Lisa Brown would like to make some comments regarding the living wage calculator that's being spoken about in this section. Lisa Brown was with us earlier, and she's the manager of community social development for the town, so she can bring us up to speed on this part of the agenda. You're going to set us up a presentation on the screen?
I'm just going to show you the calculator. And it's just having a bit of trouble. There we go. Sorry about that. I just wanted to pull up the calculator just to help walk through that. So in 2017, I presented on the living wage for Canmore, the 2017 living wage. Oh, and you can't see it. Sorry.
Drag it to the other side of the screen? No, I just think we need to.
It's a
It's on the website.
So it should be, it should be if we click and drag it.
Oh, there you go. Look at you.
Drag screen.
Oh, then I'm not going to be able to play with it, am I?
Sorry.
There. But then I won't. Oh, I guess I will be able to.
They adjusted it earlier so that they can have some views on the outlook.
Okay. Sure, this might work. All right. That probably makes a little bit more sense now.
Okay, good, thanks.
So in 2017, I presented on the living wage, Canmore's living wage. And we had a consultant come and they did the, they looked at all our expenses that made up a living wage and the taxes and the benefits associated with the living wage. Part of the living wage program, we said that we would do a Canmore-based calculator so that we can manipulate expenses and see what the outcome is to our living wage. This is that calculator. This calculator will set us up to develop a more comprehensive calculator with the intermunicipal network, which will be jointly funded by all of Alberta, and where we can make sure we're standardizing assumptions. We use certain assumptions in the expenses, so it's difficult for us to compare across municipalities when certain assumptions like transportation could be value-based more than actual something that's in the living wage calculation. So this is the living wage calculator that we developed. And there was something pretty significant that, there we go, that I wanted to bring to your attention. So as we did the living wage calculator, we went back to first principles with taxes and benefits, and we started to notice that there were a few discrepancies between the numbers that we were coming up with and the numbers that our consultant came up with. And what ended up happening is when I went into their background formulas is I noticed that there was a few things as simple as a missed bracket. And it actually caused a significant change to our living wage. So our living wage was $25 an hour, $25.24, and now it's, for a couple with 2 children, $22.65. And that is because of this miscalculation. The unfortunate thing is this was actually not, we weren't the only community that was affected by it. There were several communities. So I've reached out to a few communities who I knew use this consultant, and they have all found, unfortunately, significant errors in their living wage calculation as well. which is another benefit of having a more comprehensive living wage calculator where we can all, where these mistakes are not there. It's not, you won't have human error. So the things that I wanted to show you with this is this column here. And this is the expenses that are associated with our living wage. So for instance, this is the food. And if we were to say, have the food recovery. If we said the food recovery, we knew, did some stats. Sorry, I really am struggling with this. There we go.
You're not able to select it?
I was having trouble selecting it. So if we did some research and we found that if you use the food recovery barn, you would reduce your living wage by, or you reduce your food expenses, say, by $100 a month. We can actually make that adjustment here, see what happens.
Oh, okay. There.
And then we can see the impact on the living wage. We can do the same thing for any one of these expense lines. For taxes, we can see, I really know how to use a mouse. There we go. I must be doing something wrong. For taxes and for benefits, maybe that one, no. I just did something else here. We can see the impact that the living wage has on taxes and benefits. So again, we went back to calculations from the actual formulas instead of just going by estimators, and we were able to see the impact that a change in the living wage would have on the federal income tax, provincial income tax, CPP, on your benefit programs, on Canmore Affordable Services Program. We can see that impact, which doesn't impact a couple with 2 children, but does impact a single parent with 1 child. And then we can see that where if you were to change the wages, where certain benefits would kick in at. Yeah, so it's really interesting, and it leads to a great provincial conversation, because then you can actually start talking about the different kinds of impact that the benefits and the taxes program have across the province. Another thing that we would like to do with the more comprehensive one is to flip this around so that if you were an employer, you can know that your community has a living wage of $22 an hour, and you can say, well, I pay $15 an hour for my staff. But there are other ways to increase living wage besides increasing the actual wage. They're more like the effective wage. And that's things like healthcare benefits, or if you were to maybe do a corporate pass for elevation place, all of those will actually have an impact on the living wage. So the more comprehensive calculator, what we would like to do is flip this so that employers can go on, they can put in the wage of their staff, and then put in the different benefits, and then it will look at, you can actually see the effective living wage. I'll quickly show you the single adult and the single parent with 1 child. So it's about the same. You can see transportation is quite low because of the assumption for busing. You can see the kind of benefits and taxes that a single adult would have access to and pay. And then their living wage is $17.04. And then a single parent with 1 child, I'll quickly show you as well. And again, same thing. And you can see that Canmore Affordable Services Program kicks in here. You can change information and you can save it, so you can know that if you made certain manipulations, that you can save it and refer back to it later, and then you can always reset to get back to the baseline, which is on the left side of the screen. And that's the living wage calculator.
And in our agenda package, there is actually a link to that site.
That's right.
Is that on our website?
No,
not yet?
Because of the code that we use, we couldn't host it on our website. And the idea is that this is, I mean, it is publicly available now because it's in the committee of the whole, but it's not something we're really going to put out to the public. It's more for the discussion with the Intermunicipal Living Wage Network.
Okay, so when you mentioned that you wanted employers to work with these calculations to assess their own living wage target, is that something that they can get by going to this link?
Not yet. So
Not
that's
yet.
when we develop a more comprehensive calculator.
Okay. So that's something that you're looking for in the future? That sounds like a great idea.
Thank you.
That people can do self-assessment that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you. Thank you for this. So with the change, the error from 25.28 to 22.65 per hour, there was lots of discussion within the presentation when we were presented with that number that the changes federally to the tax system were affecting this, and so all of that discussion is not right.
All of that discussion.
Yeah, I guess.
You know, it's not that it isn't right in that context, but it's still
to that
interesting.
Extreme.
To that extreme, but
yes.
it's still quite interesting.
It seemed quite extreme when it was presented to us that these initiatives and tax changes federally were having this kind of impact on two-parent, two-family, and it almost supported a narrative that single-parent families were being pitted against two-parent families. That's what it kind of, that's not our narrative, but just from the data itself, it was kind of, that was strange. But that would not be the case at all now. We can say that there's more equality in how the two different types of households are being treated.
That's right. So in the 2017 report, it looked as if the two-parent, two-child family was paying significant income tax and not getting much benefit.
Yeah.
And I guess there could be that narrative, well, why are families paying so many taxes and a single parent, one child has less of tax structure attached to them? But I think the more important narrative would have been that once you get to a certain income threshold, taxes and benefits impact you differently. Mm-hmm. And just the expenses you need to manage a two-income, two-child family are different than the expenses you need to manage a one-parent, one-child family. So that narrative, I think, is still here a little bit, not to the same extreme extent.
Yeah, no, it was presented, but logically, based on the data, I could see the logic coming from that. But I guess I just wanted to articulate that to make sure that I was understanding this change correctly, that it's not as extreme as we thought it was.
That's right.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thank you for this. I was glad that the mistake was found, and that will be a significant change to the calculations going forward. I think that I read in the material that with the use of this tool, errors would be less likely to happen.
That's our goal. When you have a consultant come in, they're actually in the numbers, and they are changing the brackets and changing the numbers regularly for every community that they touch. It's just human error happens. But if we had the foundational equations in the background, then you're less likely to have human error.
Gotcha. And I want to thank you for, I had never heard the term precarity before. And it's a modern word, I guess, introduced in 1947 or something. I went and looked it up because I went, surely she means precariousness. But so that was good. And there was a good quote in the Wikipedia section there, part of which was, gave me pause for reflection, and I'd just like to share it, not to preach or anything. When a community is always building and enlarging and embellishing, which is good in itself, there is nothing left over for the poor. We have no right to do this as long as there are slums and breadlines somewhere. So just to, give perspective, perhaps. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council? Seeing none, thank you so much, Ms. Brown, for that update, because it was hard to understand just from the staff report, but thank you for giving us that example and demonstration. So moving on under municipal services, any other questions for administration? Can I move on to municipal infrastructure? Questions under that? Councillor Seeley?
In the planning and development Cougar Creek area, bed and breakfast, existing units being converted to bed and breakfast versus new, which is additional development. I can see the concern about additional development. Just wondering if we work through existing units being converted, or how has that played out?
Mr. Fark would like to comment on that?
So it's a bit of a complex situation. The Cougar Creek is currently in a development hold zone as a result of the Steep Creek policy approved by council. It will remain such until such time as the debris flood retention structure is constructed, hopefully breaking ground either this year or next year. The interesting thing here is that we're looking at a question of risk versus development. So conversion of a legal suite to a bed and breakfast requires a development permit because it is a discretionary use. And so the individuals who want to do that have to acquire for a development permit. So it's technically new development. The reality is that there are no more people in that suite than there would be were they continue to rent the suite as it is currently as a legal suite, for example. In fact, you can make the argument that a bed and breakfast would likely see less occupancy than a legal suite. So what we've been trying to do is we've been working with our consultants, BGC, and with some of the members of the community to find a solution to this so that we can have a risk assessment done that indicates that this new development actually does not increase the level of risk, does not increase the risk threshold. So that's the process that we're currently going through to try to find a solution for this. Because again, the reality is that changing the nature of the use of the suite does not actually change the risk profile, given that we're not intensifying the number of people who would be in the development.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
It does, and if they were applying for a new suite, that would be intensifying if there wasn't anything existing. That's
correct. If they were applying to add additional capacity, that's different than a change of use of the existing capacity.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Mr. Fish is here. Did he want to say anything on this topic? Oh. Okay. Any further questions from Councillor Seeley? No? Okay, we'll move on to Esme, Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor Sanford. I have a question about capital projects. The updates to the integrated transportation plan coming in April. I just wondered, will there be any kind of public presentation following the presentation to council?
So obviously the bringing it to the cow and then there will be a further follow-up council meeting. Those are public presentations. And then part of what the transportation plan is proposing is that a method of engagement for projects on an ongoing basis. Right? So there will be both obviously the public presentation of what the changes to the ITP are proposed to be and then indication of how engagement with the community will work on a going forward basis.
Super, thank you very much.
Any other questions under municipal infrastructure, facilities, public works? Seeing none, we can move on to the next item, which is the Council Resolution Action List. Anything on there that anybody has questions about? It looks up to date. That's good. Nothing else to add. We have a monthly board and monthly bulletin and update from Bow Valley Regional Housing at the end of the document, which everybody can read, and no questions about that. So that brings us to item I, adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn? All in favor? Carried unanimously. There we go. Thank you very much for all the information you provided us.